you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody coming along to listen this afternoon. I've given myself, or I've been asked to give myself, a very big topic, which is looking at the kind of the whole history of international business. And to do that, of course, you have to simplify, and you have to classify, and you have to reduce the whole intellectual endeavor to a few points. And I think that's been really interesting to try and do that. So I'm going to try and cover the role of theory in international business. And I think that's very appropriate, because I think one of the defining features and the outstanding features of international business is the relationship between theory and the phenomenon that it explains, and the variety of phenomena and the changing phenomena in international business. So my kind of theme, the theme that runs through it, is the relationship between theory and the changing phenomena of international business. And the first question that probably comes to mind is, why do you pick 65 years? Why is 1958 the starting point that you take? And that's a very reasonable question, because a lot of people date the founding of international business as a subject to Heimer's PhD thesis published in 1960. And I go 2 years back from that, because I think that the starting point really dates to John Dunning's book, American Investment in British Manufacturing Industry. Because I think without that book, Heimer would have been in difficulties, because that was one of the really important first indications that international business and international business theory were going to become an important phenomenon in academic life. And John Dunning did that because of the observation of a phenomenon. And that is very typical of the way that international business has developed. The observation of the phenomenon was a lot of American investment post-Second World War in British industry. And the fact that that investment outperformed domestic industry. So there were things to explain. There were important empirical and managerial phenomena that needed to be explained. And that's where international business began. Now I'm having trouble moving my slides. There we go. Right, okay, so we begin in 1958. We begin in 1958, and then with Heimer's profoundly important dissertation of 1960, which looked at the international operations of national firms. Heimer did not use the term multinational enterprise or multinational corporation. It was then thought of, and this is interesting for what comes later, that national firms did international operations. So the first issue, the first phenomenon-driven issue, was how do we explain foreign direct investment? How do we explain the fact that national firms of country A were investing in country B? And there were a number of dilemmas around that I'm going to come to, but the first issue was flows of foreign direct investment. These had become very salient in the 50s and 60s. It became obvious that American firms were investing in Europe, were buying up European firms, and indeed were outperforming European firms. So the key thing here was to explain foreign investment. And Heimer's genius was to focus on a single aspect of that. And that aspect was control. The key issue was the control of foreign investments. And that differentiated foreign direct investment from foreign portfolio investment. If I own a single share in Apple I am a foreign portfolio investor. If I own 51% of Apple, chance would be a fine thing, but if I own 51% of Apple, then I would be a foreign direct investor because I would, to all intents and purposes, control Apple. And Heimer focused on that fact, focused on control. Now, one of the very interesting things about this is that Heimer effectively ignored massive amounts of work. I wrote a paper on the pre-Heimer foreign investment literature, and there is lots of it. There's work on imperialism. There is work by economists on flows of investment. The problem was they couldn't really focus on the direct nature of the investment because they were talking about interest rates provoking moves of investment. When interest rates were higher, people moved into that country. When interest rates were lower, they moved out of it. And this did not encompass the reality of foreign direct investment and the important feature of foreign direct investment. And again, the important feature was control, the fact that you controlled part of a foreign economy. And this moved foreign direct investment into the field of industrial economics. So Heimer then succeeded in creating a subject and moving a subject forward by effectively ignoring most things that had been written before, which is extremely interesting for younger academics in the fact that we say you have to read all the literature, you have to be on top of the literature. Heimer didn't. In fact, I don't think he knew a lot of it. I'm sure he didn't. The other aspect that was in existence before Heimer, as I discovered when I wrote my article on it, was a massive amount of writing by what we would now call practitioners. These were people who were writing about the experiences of American companies in Latin America, companies investing in China, countries investing in what were then called less developed countries. And these were people who often managed these companies. Now, some of that writing is really good. I recommend it. If you look at my article and you look up some of the references in there from the 40s, 50s, even the 30s on how to manage foreign companies, it's really interesting. But it wasn't systematized. It wasn't written in the kind of terms that academics recognize. There were no established journals, and there wasn't an established group of people who worked on foreign investment. So it was unsystematized, and therefore it very largely got ignored. But the main story here is that a key empirical phenomenon in the world economy, foreign direct investment, was given a strong theoretical explanation. Heimer explained it in terms of theory, and this was developed by his supervisor Kindleberger and by John Dunning, who came up with the idea that location factors, organization and ownership factors, and internalization factors, as he added later, explain foreign direct investment. So the first real step forward in creating the subject matter of international business was to explain the empirical phenomenon of foreign direct investment. This turned out not to be enough. It turned out not to be enough because people started then looking at not just foreign direct investment, but the organization, the firm that was managing it, and the decision-making of the firm that was doing the foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment came in different forms. There was greenfield ventures where the firm invested abroad, and there were takeovers where the firm bought up an existing company. These had very different effects. So if you just looked at foreign direct investment as a single phenomenon, you were missing a lot. You were missing the whole strategy of the firm. You were missing the fact that foreign direct investment was under the control of what was then becoming called the multinational enterprise or the multinational corporation. And this was then seen not just as a company doing something abroad. It was seen as being a fundamentally different organization, a multinational firm in the way that Mark Casson and I thought of it, was the extreme form of firm. And indeed, if you look at the future of the multinational enterprise, you will see that we explained the multinational firm as the general case and the national firm as a special case where markets were not internalized across international boundaries. So the firm as an organization became the focus. And the key theoretical concept there went right back to 1937 and Ronald Coase's approach to the firm, the explanation of the firm, that a firm exists because it is superior in various ways to doing business by the market. You've got two key ways of doing business. One is to internalize and control, back to Heimer, the market, or you can use the external market. So internalization theory became the center of explaining the multinational enterprise as an organization. So there we have the second key phenomenon, the multinational firm. How do we explain the multinational firm? How do we explain its control, its dominance, its role in the world economy, and its ability to compete in foreign countries? And so you bring in internalization theory to explain the scope of the firm, and you bring in location theory to explain where it is located and how it manages its various activities abroad. The third phenomenon that I would say was a key founding principle and key issue in the development of theory in international business was to look again at the firm and to say, yes, but the firm does not only do foreign direct investment, it does lots of other things as well. It has joint ventures. How do we explain joint ventures? It has alliances which are not necessarily under its control. Why do we have alliances? And so we begin to look more into the organizational nature of the firm and its different strategies. And foreign investment is now seen as a strategy, one key element in international business strategy. But there are alternatives. You can use alliances, you can use joint ventures, and you can use subcontracting and outsourcing. And as we move on, that will become increasingly important. But the whole issue then becomes much more, not so much only a technical issue, but also focused on how we manage across borders, how we manage foreign companies, how we manage our joint venture partners, how we integrate a firm across international borders. Maybe we cannot use the ownership. Maybe we cannot carry out foreign direct investment because of government policy or other impediments. So we use joint ventures. And what problems does that create? So we're into a whole new area of theorizing here. We've moved from a simple phenomenon of foreign direct investment to the firm as the controller of that foreign investment, and then the whole rounded set of activities that the firm carries out in terms of the alternative strategies. And those three things together, I think, give us a really strong basis for saying, yes, we do have distinctive theories of international business. We do have a structure of theory that explains important phenomena in the world economy. So I now move on to my second phase of the relationship between theory and phenomenon in international business. The first phase we can call creating theory, creating the theory of international business. The second phase we can call, if you like, testing this theory. We can call it reacting to the theory. We can call it trying to see how far the theory goes. What are the boundary conditions of the theory and how far can we push it? The first area of this is extremely interesting, because the first area is about the spread of multinational firms, multinational enterprises, and the idea that their multinational enterprises can exist from emerging economies. Now, if we think back to the set of theories that I've talked about so far, there's an implicit assumption or an unthought through assumption that this will be multinationals from advanced rich countries, probably in manufacturing, probably privately owned, investing in other countries. But an important phenomenological observation was made, which is that multinationals don't just come from America, Japan, Europe. They also come from China, from India, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from Nigeria, from South Africa, lots of countries in the world. Well, how do we explain multinationals from emerging economies? And you've got a very interesting debate, which we have a number of times in international business, and that is, when we observe a new phenomenon, do we need a new theory? A new phenomenon requires a new theory, some people argue. Other people argue, no, we adapt the existing theory and we see if the existing theory will explain the change in the phenomenon, or quote, new phenomenon. And that's what we set out to do, myself and a team of people from Leeds, by looking at Chinese foreign investment. And we published a paper in 2007 that won the Gibbs Decade Award, that was, how do we explain Chinese outward foreign investment? Will existing theory explain Chinese outward foreign direct investment? And my argument here was that this was the best possible case you could have to test the theory, because Chinese outward investment was not private, it was not from a rich country, it was not mainly in manufacturing, and it had all kinds of specifically Chinese characteristics. So how do we explain Chinese foreign direct investment? So we set up an experiment, and we found that by and large, the theory that applied to multinationals in general did apply to Chinese outward foreign direct investment. There were certain features that didn't fit, which was quite good. You needed a kind of special theory within the general theory to explain Chinese outward foreign direct investment. And there were certain features of Chinese foreign direct investment as a phenomenon that were very difficult to explain. Notably, the fact that Chinese foreign investment went to high-risk countries. When you'd accounted for everything else, Chinese investment still went to higher risk countries, which the theory said you shouldn't do. Given everything else being equal, a low-risk country is preferable to a high-risk country, not for Chinese foreign investment. Why? So we have another round of theorizing, trying to explain and test why Chinese multinationals go to higher risk countries. And various explanations were put forward. Chinese multinationals don't understand risk. Chinese multinationals are driven by short-run phenomenon. The management is different, and they are centered on short-term rewards. There are political elements here. It's not just about earning income. It's also about influence, government influence, and so on. So a whole new round of theorizing about a set of issues that don't fit, which is absolutely typical, I think, of the way that international business theory has gone. And my view, it may not be everybody's, but my view is that that was a pretty satisfactory look at the strength of the theory, that the theory did do well. And people have since, of course, applied it to Indian multinationals and almost every other nationality of multinational that you care to name, and it's still held up pretty well. Secondly, the second big question The second big question is, okay, well, the theory has been very much about a single firm. It's centered on a single firm, a focal firm, we might say. But what about all the activities that firms carry out outside their own boundaries? And how about the role that they play in managing global value chains rather than trying to internalize all the activities? So the empirical observation here is one of the disaggregation of global value chains. And how do multinationals deal with that? What are the consequences of offshoring? What are the consequences of disaggregating global value chains? And here the theory, the internalization approach works pretty well, because the argument is you use the firm where it's the most effective means of doing so, and you use the market where it's the most effective means of doing so. So if I can buy a component much cheaper than I can make it, why would I try and make it? I should buy it. And so we observe the network approach, the network view to multinationals, which to some extent had already been there when we talked about joint ventures and alliances and so on, but hadn't reached the level of importance that it's shown to have in the current world economy. Now, this is a really good line of theorizing, because it enables us to look at things like, what is the impact of the fracture in the world economy between China and America? What are the likely consequences on global value chains of political change, and the issues such as friendshoring and nearshoring and the fracture of the global economy and so on. And again, you need to adapt the theory. You need to apply it sensitively. One of my colleagues once pointed out that the theory could equally be called the externalization theory of the multinational enterprise. So we have then the disaggregation of global value chains. The third big question, and I think this brings us more or less up to where we are at the moment. The third big question is, okay, multinationals are assumed to exist to make profit. They're assumed to be profit maximizers. They're assumed to respond to profit signals in terms of their location internalization decisions. But what about the role of the firm as a social entity as well as an economic entity? What about the role of the firm in social responsibility, in sustainability, in not making life worse for a lot of people who it might otherwise do so? And so we have, again, the CSR argument. How do multinationals respond to this? And of course, it's very true, isn't it, that if we think of the long run view of multinationals, social acceptability, legitimacy, and so on are essential for multinational enterprises. And indeed, multinational enterprises in managing their value chains have got huge responsibilities. One of the questions around here that arises from this phenomenon is, are multinationals responsible for their second tier, third tier producers? At the end of the day, an Apple Watch or an Apple phone has Apple on it, and the responsibility, I would argue, for everything that goes into it is ultimately Apple's responsibility. Multinationals sometimes turn around and say, it's not my factory, not my problem, it's not my factory. But if you've got a contract with that factory, then I think you are at least partially responsible if you did not write into it social values. So I think there's a big change there. We're seeing the workings out of this. This pressure is not going to go away. It's going to be greater. But again, you could argue this is a big question, right? How do multinationals move away from being seen as, or actually activating only profit-related activities, into socially responsible activities. And we're looking at that today. And that is a big question. So the first stage was building the theory. The second stage is big questions being put to that theory. And I would argue now we're into the third stage. And the third stage is actually using the theory or invoking the theory for wider social purposes. And again, grand challenges are really where we should be thinking in terms of where international business is going. If you think of any grand challenge, you think of migration, you think of climate change, you think of health and well-being, you think of human rights, you think of environmental protection, all of these. Every one of these is a global problem. None of the grand challenges can be solved nationally. And therefore, this puts international business in a fantastic position to look at these issues of grand challenges. And grand challenges also have another feature that I have argued that international business is extremely good at, and that is looking at phenomenon-driven issues. And grand challenges are clearly phenomenon-driven. You think of a grand challenge, and it's brought about by an empirical, a reality. And that reality might be changes in the climate, it may be forced migration, it might be disparities in wealth. And we have to ask, what role does international play in this? My argument in a nutshell would be that multinationals are part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution. And we can argue about the role of multinationals in grand challenges. But clearly, grand challenges are phenomenon-driven, which is good for international business. They require interdisciplinary analysis. And here I think we have to go a lot wider than we have done. We might think of interdisciplinary as working with other areas of management. We might think of it as working with other areas of social science. But I think when we think of grand challenges, we have to think about it much wider in terms of working with scientists and so on, health specialists, scientists, and so on. Grand challenges also can be looked at many different levels. Indeed, one of the real issues with grand challenges is at what level do we challenge it? At what level do we look at this? Clearly, the global level is important, but there are lots of other levels that we can look at. So there's issues around that. And finally, grand challenges involve not just business, but also business, government, and civil society. And I've just done a piece on what I call 3 vectors of power, where I look at the multinational being subject to the market, to government influence, and to the influence of civil society. And I would argue that civil society is the one that we have not paid sufficient attention to, and that both us as an academic community and multinationals need to pay a great more attention to. So I think we're now looking at an area where international business and grand challenges really intersect. This is really exciting because it opens up massive amounts of opportunity for us as international business specialists to work on these issues. Just take the SDGs. They represent a fantastic research agenda for us all. So I think this is where we are at the moment, looking at the theory of international business in terms of the phenomenon that arise from grand challenges. One point that I have sadly neglected up to this point, before I come to my conclusion, is that I haven't said enough about the role of the cultural context and cultural differences. But my argument would be this, that as we move through the argument that I've made, the role of cultural difference, the role of international differences in culture, cultural interaction, the need to manage across cultures becomes greater as we move through these various things. We started with a fairly technical issue of FDI. We then moved to management in multinationals, and we've moved on to social interaction between business and the global economy. And the role of culture increases as we move through all those steps. So it's become increasingly imperative, I think, that we pay much more attention to the role of culture in the issues that we've been talking about. Right, so international business is just as exciting, if not more exciting now than it was in 1960 or 1958 when we started. It may have started by looking at technical, empirical phenomena, but it's become much more rounded, much more embedded in other kinds of areas. And I would argue that now international business, because of the head of steam that it's built up, because of its successes, and I think there have been real successes in explaining empirical phenomena, now needs to be put to look at these issues of CSR, sustainability, SDGs, and so on. Also to look at the pressures on business, because I think we have to remember that managers in multinationals are now under incredible pressure, not just to manage their activities in the interest of the firm, but indeed to manage their resources in the interests of society. They're doing this in the most difficult of circumstances, because we have the fracture in the world economy, which I'm also very involved with writing about, between the US and China, and the different camps that the world is fragmenting into, the breakup of the infrastructure of international trade, the so-called splinternet, splintering the internet, the fracture in the global economy, protectionism, anti-globalization, and the arguments about national security being given extra force, and therefore multinationals operating, as I say, within these three vectors of force upon them: the role of the market, the role of government, and the role of civil society. So, you know, in the words of the Chinese curse, we live in interesting times. I mean, multinationals operate in very interesting times. And really, how people cannot be excited about international business and the role of international business at the moment is quite beyond me, because this is exactly where all the action is at the moment. Thank you very much. I'll stop there and take questions.